I'm Mr. Dodd. I'm a student at Lindsey Wilson College in the education program. I'm a junior and also am on the wrestling team. I'm going to teach you a lesson today over in the World War II and mainly over the atomic bomb. So can I have a student pass out the bell ringer? I'm going to take attendance. Brooke Ansel.
Here.
Chelsea Blair.
Here.
Jesse Brockman. Gracie Kate.
Here.
Paul Franklin.
Here.
Anakin Harris.
Here.
Hannah Jasper.
Here.
Kayla Keene.
Here.
Sydney Lawson.
Here.
Sumner Melson.
Here.
Sorry. Dalen Hopwell.
Sure.
Shelby Rogers.
Here.
Jamie Rowell.
Here.
Dylan Shepard.
Oh, he's not here.
And Jacob Williams.
Here.
Did you get it? Just get the check mark, you got it. Is it green? Yep.
When you're done with the bell ringer, just pass it up and I'll collect it.
Front wide off to see it. Those little spaces, pixels are dying. I just turn the front one off. See if it's up, I think. I get them backwards myself. Just push it.
Alright, is everybody finished? Everybody still working? You wanna pass those up? That's kinda like a pre-assessment, just to kinda get your knowledge over, the atomic bomb and, World War II. Before we start the lesson, I just want to ask you a couple things. What are some things that you know about the atomic bomb dropping? Does anybody know anything? Or have, I guess, learned throughout their education? Yes. All right. So we're gonna examine it during the PowerPoint of why we dropped the atomic bomb and some of the critical questions that come along with that. So the importance of ending of World War I. All right. So Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945, and there was two conferences by the ending months of the war. So the couple of conferences were the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference. A big thing about the Yalta Conference is the Allies, so the big three, Russia, England, and the U.S., their leaders, Stalin, Winston Churchill, and FDR, knew that the Allies were going to win. Germany had just surrendered, so they knew that they were going to win the war. So the big thing about Yalta is post-war war. We're going to look at that, and it examines what we're going to do post-war. Stalin is obviously, USSR was communist, and that kind of scared the US and England, so we're going to examine that. The big thing to know about the Yalta Conference is FDR is in his dying months. He literally dies of March 1945, so he's a dying man, so that's a big thing to know about Yalta. He obviously is paralyzed and has polio, and so he's obviously going to die a month later. And then the Potsdam Conference, that is where they discussed the surrendering of Japan. So I discussed the big three. That's Winston Churchill of England, which is right here. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, is right here, and then Stalin, who was nicknamed Uncle Joe, is right here. And they met, obviously I talked about it. Yeah.
Can you go back?
Yeah.
Where?
Just hit the back. I got it. I keep.
There we go. Good. Alright. So the big three I discussed, Winston Churchill, FDR, and Joseph Stalin, met to discuss post-war, so Europe after World War II. And again, this was FDR's last meeting before he died in April. So 6 topics that were discussed at Yalta was the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, so Germany, Italy, and Japan. So the League of Nations, which was created after the war to end all wars, the World War I, was ineffective, obviously because it was set in place to never have a war again. We just had another world war. So they discussed the making of the United Nations, which is still in place today, and it's the international organization to keep peace after war. Continuing on to the discussions that were discussed, or as topics that were discussed. Russia would enter the war against Japan, so they would declare war on Japan and help the U.S. Invade Japan, because they had just helped invade Germany and make Germany surrender. So, and then the big thing was to divide Austria, Germany, and the capital Berlin into 4 occupied zones. So this is Germany. I'm not a good artist, obviously. But if this is Germany, the USSR would get right on the right side of Germany. And then this was occupied into 3 zones. French, England, and then the US. And so obviously this is a depiction of people that democracy and then communism. And that's going to play a big role in the Cold War. And then this was the capital of Berlin, which they also split in half. So it's big. So Yalta is laying the foundation of the Cold War. So that's it's Germany. So it's a better depiction. Split in half. Soviet Union side of Germany, and then you have the British zone, the US zone, and the French zone. So Roosevelt and Churchill, obviously they're for democracy and Stalin for communism. They were both afraid that Stalin would make Eastern Europe communist after the war, because Russia occupied Eastern Europe. So the big thing that they wanted was self-determination, right to choose democracy or communism. And those countries were Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, which actually become a part of the USSR. So another thing that they wanted to prevent, the rise of communism and the spread of the beliefs, which we were not able to prevent. Stalin agreed to the self-determination of Eastern Europe if he could have part of Poland, and then so he would get Poland, but they had to have free elections. So that was the democracy side, so it was kind of a bargain a lot with politics. And so they got free elections, but they weren't really like free elections. It was like one person on the ballot, so they had elections, but it was really. So this is Stalin here, the Potsdam Conference. So FDR has already died, so we're moving into Potsdam. This is Harry Truman, and that's Winston Churchill. So Truman becomes president with the death of FDR. The Potsdam Conference. So the big thing, so after Germany surrendered, Stalin begins pressuring Eastern Europe to become communist, like we talked about. Truman's unhappy with these pro-Soviet governments and demands Stalin allow free elections, as he agreed in Yalta. So he refused to freely elect governments in Eastern Europe, and he was afraid with allowing elections that they would become anti-Soviet. So the big thing about the end of World War II is that they're looking post-war to Europe, and they're trying to, promote their beliefs in government. a view. It's a view of Europe. I guess post-war Europe. So you're seeing the green is the USSR. So this is communist country. So Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, which we talked about, and Poland, all became USSR. So I guess the fear of Truman and Winston Churchill and FDR actually became true. And so that's laying the groundwork to the Cold War. While at Potsdam, Truman learns the atomic bomb is ready. And so at the Potsdam, the biggest thing is they gave the Potsdam Declaration, which gave Japan an ultimatum to unconditionally surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. And the big thing is understanding the Japanese culture. At this time, they were over the samurai code, which is Bushido. And the big thing is they do not ever want to surrender. It's against the law in Japan to surrender. Samurais would never surrender. They would rather commit suicide. So they would actually fall on their own swords and kill themselves. So that's a big thing that Japan has kept, I guess, culturally through the centuries. So, so it's a big, Japan would not surrender. So we have to drop, I guess, the atomic bombs. So that's a picture of one being detonated. And so this is the I guess the start of the atomic bomb section. So Albert Einstein, who came from Germany, escaped from Germany to the U.S., which is he's probably the greatest scientist ever. So in 1932, so 13 years before we dropped the bomb, Albert Einstein wrote to the president, FDR, of Nazi Germany's efforts to purify uranium-253. So the uranium can be used to create the atomic bomb, and shortly after, the U.S. Government began seriously working on the Manhattan Project. So that was them creating the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project's main objective was to conduct research that would produce the atomic bomb. The project took 6 years, so it started in 1939. It took $2 billion, and so to create the bomb. The key member at the project was Robert Oppenheimer, who oversaw the designing and building of the atomic bomb. So when they're testing the gadget, so that's the first atomic bomb, is much smaller, and it was at July 16th, 1945, at the Trinity site in New Mexico. So it's in the middle of the desert. They have, I guess, like a bomb practice site. And so the bomb excelled upward to 360 feet per second and made a mushroom cloud over 30,000 feet. So all that remained on the soil at the blast site were fragments of jade green radioactive glass created by the heat of the reaction. So the heat is of the atomic bomb is unbearable. We'll see pictures, I think, of like the aftermath and things like that. So that's a big thing, that the atomic bomb, when it detonates, it creates, first it makes a huge light that's similar to like kind of like the sun, and then it creates extreme heat. So the extreme light, who swore the neighborhood or the nearby neighborhoods are far away, swore the sun had come up twice that day just due to the blast intensity. And Oppenheimer was famously quoted, "I'm death, the destroyer of worlds." He understood that they had just created a mass weapon, mass destruction weapon. And so back to the Potsdam Declaration. And so the Declaration obviously wanted the unconditional surrender of Japan, prompt or utter destruction. So, and so Japan actually rejected, and so it led directly to Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th of 45. Big thing here is Truman did not want to go into another battle. We had just fought in the Pacific theater. We were island hopping to get into where we could actually fly a plane to Japan, and we were having massive numbers lost. Iwo Jima was a big one, and there's a couple movies on that, and it just shows you how, I guess, it was just brutal for us. And so I guess he took in the factor of how many lives he would save of U.S. people and how many lives of Japanese people he would save. So he also decides to drop the bomb. On August 6th, so on Hiroshima, the dropping of the little boy is what it was nicknamed. A B-2 bomber, the plane was named Enola Gay, piloted by Paul Tibbets. Hiroshima was an important military center with 43,000 soldiers and 300,000 civilians. So they dropped it early in the morning at 8:15. It weighed almost 10,000 pounds, so this thing is massive. And then the Fat Man, which is the next one, is even more bigger. But the blast was equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, so just gives you an idea how catastrophic it was. So this is before and after photos. As you can see, completely destroyed. There's a church here, a little bit of it remains, but it's completely wiped out. And you can actually search on the internet before and after photos, and you can see it's a tremendous effect of the bomb. The effects of the little boy, those closest to the explosion died instantly, and their bodies were burned to black char. It burned fabrics of clothing into victims' skins, and shadows of bodies were literally put onto the wall. So if I'm walking my dog, my shadow would be on the wall, just because that's how intense it was. 9 out of 10 people, half a mile or less from ground zero, were dead. Less than 10% of the buildings in Hiroshima survived the blast, so it was complete destruction. 70,000 people died from the initial blast, heat and radiation, and the 5-year death toll reached over 200,000. So we're talking big numbers. All right, so Nagasaki, Japan, and the dropping of the Fat Man. And so then we dropped it 3 days later because they did not surrender after the bombing. And so the plane was named Bockscar. It missed its target by half a mile due to clouds. Nagasaki is kind of elevated with mountains and things like that. It's a big thing about Japan. They don't have any natural resources because there's so many mountains. And so it kind of offered a strategic, kind of a blockage to the bomb. So it missed its targets by half a mile, but still leveled half of the city of Nagasaki, which was a big industrial center for Japan. It was 40% greater than the little boy, so almost half. 40,000 people died and 60,000 were injured, and then as time went on, there was more effects from the radiation, such as cancer and things like that. So why do you think they dropped the bomb in 2 cities and not a small island on Japan? Why do you think they chose to bomb 2 cities? Does anybody have an idea or a guess at that? So when we're thinking about the Yalta Conference, we're thinking communists versus democracy, thinking about post-war. We were allies with them, but we were kind of skeptical of their views on government. So the USSR. So a big thing that's argued is that we dropped the bomb on the two small cities as kind of to show them, like, hey, we have another bomb, which we really didn't yet. So watch it, like, it's kind of a way to check them, like, keep them accountable. Don't take over the Eastern Europe with your social, or with communism and things like that. So we obviously could have easily dropped it on smaller cities, or smaller islands. So that's a big thing that's argued. So the day after Nagasaki, the Emperor of Japan overruled the military leaders. So the Emperor was just ceremonial. The military leaders were actually the ones that were in charge, and forced them to surrender. So August 12th, they accepted Japan's surrender. And the end of World War II, September 2nd, the formal surrender ceremony took place on the deck of the USS Missouri. The surrender of the Japanese forces officially ended World War II. So the bomb was argued as a political move towards the USSR to keep them in check. So we were thinking ahead of the war. So that's the end of that. So now we're going to just examine how the bombing should be remembered. Actually, can I have like a student pass this down here? What you guys?
You guys
Got it? We're gonna read this. This is two sides of the story. The first side is so the Japanese take on it, and then the second side is the U.S.'s stuff. And then from here, I'm going to split the room, and we're going to look at documents and pictures, and we're going to just decide how the atomic bomb dropping should be remembered. So can I have a volunteer to read the first narrative? You got it?
So just the one under Hiroshima as a victim.
Yeah, as victimization.
Japanese still recall the war experience primarily in terms of their own victimization. For them, World War II calls to mind the deaths of families of acquaintances on distant battlefields, and more vividly, the prolonged systematic bombing of their cities. If it was argued that the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima was necessary to shock the Japanese to surrender, how does one justify the hasty bombing on Nagasaki only 3 days later, before the Japanese had time to investigate Hiroshima and formulate a response?
All right, so they're obviously looking at the deaths of their families and I guess Japanese as a whole, and then they're questioning how does one justify the hasty bombing of Nagasaki. And then can I have a volunteer for the next one? All right. To most Americans, Hiroshima, the shattered atomized, irradiated city remains largely a symbol of triumph, marking the end of a horrendous global conflict and the effective demonstration of a weapon that prevented another world war. It is hard to imagine that the Japanese would have surrendered without the atomic bomb. Japanese battle plans that were in place when the bombs were dropped called for a massive suicidal defense of the home islands, in which the imperial government would mobilize not only several million fighting men, but also men of ordinary citizens who had been trained and indoctrinated to resist the end of the primitive makeshift weapons. For Japanese to even discuss surrender was against the law. So they're obviously looking on the other side of the coin. of how many lives were actually saved by dropping the bomb. Which narrative do you guys agree more with? The first one or the second one? Which kind of side do you take on it? The second one? Okay, so looking at the US side and how so many more lives were saved. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to split the room this side, so you're going to become Japanese, split it right here, so you're going to become Japanese experts on that, on the drop-in. So I'm going to take out, I'll give you guys documents until you guys are going to group together. I'm going to give you another sheet, and we're going to look at the documents and create what we think or how the atomic bomb should be, remember. So obviously this side of the class is the American side. So you're going to take the American side of the views of the second side. You're going to look through these documents. With you guys. So group up. We're gonna become experts on the experience. Who wants to be the writer of this group? Okay. Alright, who wants to be the writer of this group? You just have to record the name. Alright, so let's read through these documents.
Do we have document B, or is it just the, do we read all of it?
I think you read all of it.
Okay. I'll read this. Everybody like to read to themselves, or would we like to have a designated? Who wants to?
I think it should be fine.
Yeah, I know you're illiterate. Alright, I guess I will be the reader then. Let's start off with document B, because I like to talk a little bit. My division, like most of one's transferred from Europe, was going to take part in the invasion of Honshu, an island of Japan. The people who prefer invasion to A bombing seem to have no intention of proceeding to the Japanese part themselves. I've already noted that a few more days would have been the Japanese troops and sailors on the spot. On Okinawa, only a few weeks before Hiroshima, 123,000 Japanese and Americans would kill each other. War is immoral, war is cruel. Okay, now we'll read that. That's exciting. Even before the bomb was tested, American officials began to debate how to use it. Admiral William Leahy, chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Staff, opposed using the bomb because it killed civilians indiscriminately. He believed that economic blockade and conventional bombing would convince Japan to surrender. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wanted to warn the Japanese about the bomb while at the same time telling them that they could keep their emperor if they surrendered.
You guys kind of
Secretary of State James Bryan, Secretary of State James Bryan, however, wanted to drop the bomb without any warning to shock Japan into surrender. President Truman later wrote that he regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubts that it should be used. His advisors had warned him to expect massive casualties in the United States invading Japan. Truman believed it was his duty as president to use every weapon available to save American lives. So we get quotes now. Alright, so what do you got? War is cruel, all killed innocents. We're supposed to be. I mean, it's looking. We only got a whole lot right now. Well, here, I'll just tell you this right now that he felt it was Truman's duty to use every weapon to prevent more lives lost. Like you said, war is cruel.
So on document C, you might want to use what we kind of talked about. Russia might be more manageable if impressed by American military might. So administration of the bomb might impress Russia and keep them in check. So that's a argument for the bomb.
To prevent lives being. That's for the Russian bombing Sherman's duty. And it's a military, like a military, and they put down in a military display to prevent the spread of communism. A tactic to bring the war to a sudden end.
Yeah, so what are some things that go for the Japanese first narrative? Our families and
It's hard to tell, his skull was cracked up, and his flesh was dangling out of his head. Let's read this, is where I learned. Hold on, let me read you.
so it gives a.
All I can remember was a pale light and a lightning flash for 2 or 3 seconds, then I collapsed. I don't know much how it passed before I came to.
It was I guess those probably argues like
Above the nuclear sandy dust strategy. I called it a degree, trying to find someone who could steal you guys. Then I found one of my classes.
Just try to make them feel.
I held him up in my
Make
arms.
them
It's hard to
feel
tell
the
his skull was
emotions.
cracked up, but his flesh was dangling out from his head.
So that's a.
He had only one eye left and was looking right at me. He told me to go away.
Jesus.
How is that? You have to be,
One eye.
you have to be behind. There's just one eye with and have your whole.
That's not good.
Actually, you'd be surprised.
Well, I mean, it might.
During an atomic bomb, the safest place to be if you're in the city is the middle floor, like the middle room of the building, in the center floor.
Did you die?
So he literally, his classmate.
He died on the streets or anything.
One eye
I
left.
saw his room was trying to grab my ankles and they were asking me to.
And then document E, document like preschool. Just the numbers, so you might know the actual numbers.
The water was
So
down.
many people.
That's all really all the points we need. Erase that one. That's not a good demonstration for you. It's not a good demonstration.
Document D was pretty.
The kid looked out the window and wondered if big tornadoes coming.
Everybody just sit there.
But the friend that was like,
We're gonna pass out some pictures. I'm not gonna get to the other activities, but this kind of shows all the. That kind of shows.
Alright, so I've got for our main point, Shelby has written down, war schools.
So we're not gonna get to the other activities, but this was a part of his pictures, so it just shows you things of the atomic bomb and the bombing and things like that. So if you want to pass those around. And so in about 3 minutes, we're gonna have a discussion on how we should remember the atomic bomb.
Just technically, we do not figure that out.
$255,000. So you
And
can,
you're-
$135,000. You can write your points and then, you know, have to cash.
That's all we've got on board is.
Should have write it. We're just gonna, like, just groups points and that's.
I put Warrior School, I put suicide bomb in front of all the prison and war camps. What is that, what was that death march?
Or is your name?
What was the death march called?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I can't, because my insurance is out.
Back on the Krusty Krab.
I don't pay it. Well, so I have to wait till Friday till I get a paycheck.
Oh, yeah.
But my insurance is expired.
How was it out?
Apparently it's been out since March.
All right, so who, let's start the discussion. Which side wants to start, the American side or the Japanese?
I kinda wanna hear the Japanese side first.
Okay, so deferring to the Japanese side, so what, give me a point of the atomic bomb, so your guys' argument.
Okay, well, we have the US could warn the Japanese like to keep their emperor, but instead they dropped the bomb to like shock them into surrendering. So they didn't really have much influence.
Okay,
And then, we also have like one survivor, it says his skull was cracked open and his flesh was dangling out from his head.
okay, so giving the, from document, I guess, D, so the emotional pill from the survivor and how, I guess, how bad the destruction after the bomb was. So can you give me a side of your American expert?
Well, aside from the emotional appeal, we all feel like, we use the pictures as,
Yeah.
okay, that's fine. We chose to use as Pearl Harbor because Japanese did suicide bomb Pearl Harbor. They ran planes into our warships, killing American soldiers and killing themselves. We also used prisoner of war camps, the death, I can't remember, Mr. Bone, what was the name of that march?
Bataan.
Bataan Death March, marched American soldiers for 70 miles, cutting their heads off, running them over in tanks, etc. Okay, you can go now.
So you guys have another point, so they're kind of looking at the Japanese side of the coin of what their government did to us, so we retaliated.
Well, we just had like, we were killing the burns and stuff and the radiation to us. And like there's like 66,000 died in Hiroshima and 39,000 in Nagasaki. So
Yeah.
more people died over the years.
Yeah,
Because
so
of the bombings, and they didn't really know why.
what was the number, Hiroshima? The deaths, 70,000 people died and exceeded over 200,000. And so that was a lot of civilians, so you guys are looking at the civilian side. You wanna touch on that?
There is some sort of casualties, but that was just really cool. Pearl Harbor, I think we had anything else. I'll just bring up another point. Now you all said there was no, Japan said there was no such thing as surrender for them. But, but if that was the case, then that would mean war would just continue, causing us to, just more money being sunk into the ocean, literally. And, we used, the bomb as just a warning symbol for all countries.
Okay, so that's it.
We were gonna destroy them.
Yeah.
We did
So
give
was-
you a
We
warning.
wanted
What was that quote? What was the quote from the front?
We will literally
It's-
destroy.
It's, surrender,
Go on,
ultimate,
do it.
Well, we
surrender
said
now,
that.
and ultimate destruction.
I thought one of them was under the arms.
Yeah, so prompt and utter destruction. So we did give them warning, so
We
that's,
did give them warnings.
and the big thing that y'all pointed on is the display of the bomb. So the display to impress Russia, I think that was document,
C, no, or C, yes.
yeah, C. All right, so collectively as a class, how do you feel about that? How do you feel it should be remembered?
I feel like it should be remembered as like, we try, it's like that, what's that treaty back in the world, or the revolutionary, the, olive branch thing?
Olive branch treaty.
We extended our arm, we said, you know, we can forget this, you can surrender now, or we'll have to do something about it. And when they didn't do something, or when they said no, we did something about it. And I think that should just display of how strong we are as a nation and what we're capable of doing.
You guys kind of agree on the American side or the Japanese side with this
I'm-
Japanese experience group?
I agree with the American side.
Okay, do you have reasons?
Well, most of my reason is because I had a family member who died there.
Okay.
at Pearl Harbor.
At Pearl Harbor, okay, so you're directly affected at it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when you look at what the, I guess, the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, the things that Japan did to us, and made our decision easier, Truman really had the best interest of the U.S. at front of his mind when making the decision. He didn't want to kill any other U.S. soldiers, and he was really, his popularity was actually spiked because of that, so. If you guys want to make a stack of all your papers, I'm gonna give the exit slip. So this is the exact same thing as your bell ringer. So you're gonna answer the same questions, and it's like an assessment. The only difference on the back of this, I just want, on the back of the bell ringer, like if you have any questions, or something that you learned that you want to write down, just write it on the back of the thing. And I will actually get back to you with the questions that you have, so.
Here's what it's right
Sorry, yeah, kind of bombarding you.
Okay, here, who else has pictures? Are these just all pictures?
Yeah.
Here's the text documents. Here's a. You got this. I'll try to get them all over there.
You're fine, yeah.
Okay, well, I need one more document signature.
Yeah, so answer the bell ringer. On the back side, if you have any questions or something that you learned on the day, write that, and I'll actually get back to you with the questions that you have, so. And then when you're done with the bell ringer, I can take it up if you just want to hold it.